Shocking alligator attack in Florida. 31-year-old hiker dies after arm torn off while cooling in river. A peaceful hiking trip near Orlando, Florida turned into a devastating tragedy when a 31-year-old woman was fatally attacked by an alligator while cooling off in a shallow river with her boyfriend and a friend. Now let's explore complete story from every perspective on our AI podcast.
If you step into the shallow end of a municipal swimming pool, 3 feet of water just feels like the ultimate safety zone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it barely reaches your waist.
Right, because you can stand up, you can breathe easily, and your brain just tells you that you are in total, undeniable control of your environment. But if you take that exact same depth, just 3 feet of water, and you move it to a wild river in Central Florida, you haven't just changed locations.
No, you've completely changed the stakes.
Exactly. You have just stepped directly into the perfect ambush zone for an apex predator.
It's an incredibly dangerous mental blind spot that we all share.
Yeah.
We're just so accustomed to curating our environments, that we carry our domestic expectations right out into the wild. We see water that's shallow, and our instinct is to treat it like a backyard wading pool.
Like it's just there for us to use.
Completely forgetting that we are crossing a boundary. We're stepping into a living, breathing ecosystem that plays by an entirely different set of rules.
And that is exactly what we are digging into for today's deep dive. We've got a source document in front of us titled Tragedy on the Econlockhatchee River.
It's a really heavy source.
It is. And our mission today is to completely reconstruct this devastating encounter where a sunny, entirely normal Sunday hike turned fatal in just a matter of seconds.
Yeah, literally seconds.
We're going to break down the sheer shock of this event, analyze the psychology of how we recreate outdoors, and explore the highly methodical wildlife investigation that immediately followed.
It is a genuinely harrowing sequence of events to examine. But, by breaking down the mechanics of exactly how and why this happened, we gain a crucial understanding of what it actually means to share space with untamed nature.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really comprehend the shock of this attack, we have to meticulously build the scene.
Right. The setup is so important here.
We have to look at the setup because it's just so agonizingly normal. So it was Sunday.
Just a regular weekend.
Yeah, right around 1:30 in the afternoon, squarely in the middle of the afternoon heat. A 31-year-old woman from Orlando, her boyfriend, and a friend were out hiking.
And they were at the Econlockhatchee River near Orlando.
Right. And our source material explicitly makes a point to note that this is a popular natural spot.
That phrase is going to be really important later.
Definitely. So they were hot. They were looking for some relief from the Florida sun. So they entered the water just to cool down.
Makes total sense. Anyone would do it.
Exactly. They were just kneeling in the water. And the detail that just anchors this whole tragedy is the depth. The water was estimated to be only 3 feet deep.
That measurement is the linchpin of the entire scenario. 3 feet.
It's nothing.
It seems like such a trivial amount of water to a human being,
Right, but hold on. I have to push back on this right away. Because physically, my brain is having a hard time visualizing this.
The geometry of it.
Yeah, the geometry. You're talking about an animal that can grow to the size of a small car. How does a massive prehistoric predator hide completely in 3 feet of water?
It does seem impossible.
It just doesn't seem geometrically possible. If I'm in 3 feet of water, everyone can see exactly where I am.
It's a great question, and I think it really highlights the difference in how our bodies operate versus theirs.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when you or I get into 3 feet of water, we remain vertical.
Right, we stand.
We displace water clumsily. But an alligator is biologically engineered for this exact environment. They don't stand, they flatten.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they compress their massive bodies entirely flush against the muddy riverbed. They lower their heart rates, they stay absolutely motionless, and their coloration blends perfectly with the shadows and the silt.
So they are practically invisible.
Completely invisible to a human eye scanning the surface. In 3 feet of water, they only really need to leave the tiny slits of their nostrils above the silt to breathe.
That is terrifying.
It is. So while we look at 3 feet of water and think, I can touch the bottom, I'm perfectly safe, the alligator views that exact same 3 feet as a tactical advantage.
It's their perfect hunting ground.
Exactly. It's enough water to conceal their entire mass while keeping them well within striking distance of the shoreline.
That drastically changes how you look at a river.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to another detail you mentioned earlier, the idea of this being a popular natural spot.
Yeah, that phrasing.
Because that phrase carries a lot of psychological weight, doesn't it?
It does. It completely alters our risk assessment. I mean, think about what goes through your mind when you visit a popular trail.
You see footprints in the mud?
Right. You see maybe a stray candy wrapper or signs marking a path. You hear other people laughing in the distance.
And without even realizing it, your brain registers those signs of human presence as like a safety guarantee.
Yes. We unconsciously assume that if hundreds of other people have walked this path and waded in this water without getting hurt, the area must be sanitized of danger.
We basically assume that a crowd acts as an invisible shield.
That's a perfect way to put it.
We think our sheer numbers keep the wild animals away.
Exactly. The human mind just naturally equates popularity with predictability. We assume a popular hiking spot is as controlled as a city park.
So we let our guard down completely.
Completely. Which makes the contrast of what happens next so horrifying.
Because this group is just kneeling there in the shallows.
Just trying to cool off?
They're doing what anyone would do on a hot Sunday afternoon. And this perfectly serene break is violently shattered. The alligator suddenly emerges from that concealed, shallow water and strikes.
There's absolutely no warning.
None. And the details in the source are just incredibly grim. It emerged and clamped its jaws around both of her arms.
Both arms. The mechanics of an ambush like this, they rely entirely on sudden, overwhelming force.
Because there's no rustling in the bushes to alert you.
Right. There's no time to evaluate the threat or plan an escape. It literally goes from absolute stillness to catastrophic violence in a fraction of a second.
And if we try to put ourselves in the shoes of the people there, I mean, the chaos of that moment is just impossible to fathom.
It's a nightmare.
You have the boyfriend standing in the water, desperately struggling to physically pull her away from the animal's grip.
He's engaged in a literal tug of war with an apex predator.
But at the exact same time, he is attempting to dial emergency services.
It's hard to even picture doing that.
And the friend is standing right there, trying to assist, but also forced to watch this catastrophic injury unfold in real time. Because the alligator ultimately severs one of her arms and severely damages the other.
It's a nightmare scenario where all of those illusions of safety we talked about are just stripped away instantly.
And NBC News actually released the 911 call from this exact moment. The source spends time on the details of that audio, and it really requires us to stop and analyze what's happening.
Because the audio captures the raw, unfiltered reality of the attack.
It does. It completely removes the clinical, detached tone of a news report and drops you squarely into the panic of the scene.
That audio is probably the most visceral piece of evidence we have.
You can hear the boyfriend screaming for help in the background while he is physically fighting this massive animal.
Just unimaginable terror.
Meanwhile, the friend is on the phone with the dispatcher. And the dispatcher is doing what dispatchers are trained to do. You know, trying to maintain calm, offering reassurance, trying to assess the situation.
Protocol.
Right. And the friend is repeatedly trying to describe the severity of the injuries. At first, the friend says that both arms are, quote, basically gone.
Yeah, that word basically is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really is. But then the dispatcher asks a very direct question about the missing limb.
And the friend's response shifts completely.
It does. The friend responds with a single, chilling word. Gone. Just that one word.
That shift in language is incredibly revealing when you look at the neurology of acute trauma.
How so? Because I noticed that shift immediately.
Well, you go from a descriptive, almost conversational phrase like, basically gone, which feels like it still holds on to a tiny shred of hopeful ambiguity.
Maybe it's just a really severe injury.
Right, but then it drops to this stark, hollow, one-word answer. It feels like you can literally hear the shock taking over her brain.
Wow, so what's happening chemically there?
Well, when a human being is suddenly thrust into a life-or-death, highly traumatic situation, the brain is flooded with adrenaline and stress hormones.
It goes into overdrive.
Exactly. And the higher cognitive functions, the parts of our brain responsible for nuance, polite conversation, descriptive vocabulary, they just shut down.
They are useful in a survival situation.
No, not at all. The brain abandons complex language because it is too busy trying to process the catastrophic visual data it's receiving.
The brain literally can't match what the ears are hearing with the nightmare the eyes are seeing.
Precisely. The dispatcher is this calm voice on the phone saying, "Help is on the way. Tell me what is happening."
Trying to establish order.
Right. But the friend on the riverbank is staring at a physical impossibility, a severed limb.
It's just too much to process.
The sheer violence of it breaks the brain's ability to form sentences. So all the descriptive padding just falls away, and you're left with the only undeniable fact remaining. Gone.
And while the friend is trying to communicate that impossible reality, you have to think about the boyfriend's position in the water. The multitasking happening there defies imagination.
It is an absolute overload of the human nervous system.
Yeah.
I mean, he is fighting biology with his bare hands while desperately trying to summon the modern world to intervene via a cell phone.
It's just a devastating image.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that collision between the wild and the modern world doesn't end when the physical attack stops. The aftermath triggers an entirely different, incredibly intense process.
It does, because despite the immediate emergency response of the boyfriend and that 911 call, the victim, this 31-year-old woman, tragically dies before she can even be transported to a hospital.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is. Lieutenant Grant Eller of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the FWC, officially confirms this. And while authorities begin the grim task of working to notify her out-of-state family, the scene at the Econlockhatchee River completely transforms.
The shift in operations is immediate and honestly quite drastic.
How so?
Well, the moment the medical emergency concludes, the focus pivots entirely to securing the environment.
And they don't just put up police tape, do they?
No, not at all. Seminole County Sheriff's deputies arrive, and they bring in a professional wildlife trapper.
They go right back into that exact stretch of shallow water.
The same water where it just happened.
Right. And they specifically remove 2 massive alligators. Our source notes one measured 13 feet in length and the other measured 12 feet.
Just absolute monsters.
They pull these massive animals out of the river. And then officials take DNA samples from both of these reptiles and send them to a laboratory for analysis.
To determine exactly which one of the 2 was responsible for the attack.
It is a highly specialized, methodical wildlife investigation. But wait, I have to stop you there.
Okay, what is it?
Because to a layperson, this sounds incredibly strange. The tragedy has already occurred. The victim has tragically passed away. Why go to the immense trouble, the sheer danger, and the expense of bringing in professional trappers, capturing multiple massive animals, taking biological swabs, and running laboratory DNA tests?
It does seem like a lot after the fact.
Why not just put up a sign and close the park? Are they trying to put an alligator on trial?
It's a very fair question, and I think it's easy to misinterpret that level of forensic response.
It can look like a quest for vengeance.
Exactly. Like the authorities are hunting down the guilty animal to punish it. But that is not what wildlife management is doing here. This is a highly precise protocol designed entirely for public safety.
So explain the mechanics of that. Why does it require a DNA lab test?
Well, think of it less like a criminal trial and more like ballistic fingerprinting for a weapon. This river is a popular natural spot, right?
Right. People are going to want to go back eventually.
Eventually, human beings are going to return to this area. The authorities have to ensure that the specific animal that has now demonstrated a willingness to attack humans in this shallow wading area is removed.
Because once an animal crosses that line, the risk to the public is just too high.
Exactly. But they can't just wade in and blindly clear out the entire local ecosystem.
Right, they can't just kill everything.
Removing a 12-foot and a 13-foot predator is incredibly dangerous, highly specialized work. If they just trap the first large alligator they see, declare the river safe, and reopen the park, they are just guessing.
And if they guess wrong?
If they guess wrong, they might leave the actual threat sitting right there in the 3-foot shallows, waiting for the next hiker.
Ah, I see. That makes a lot of sense.
The DNA test, swabbing the jaw or the stomach to match it to the tragic scene, is the only objective scientific way authorities can definitively prove they have neutralized the specific active threat to the public.
It's about certainty.
Yes. It's about restoring safety with scientific certainty, rather than just indiscriminately killing local wildlife.
That makes perfect sense. It's a targeted elimination of a confirmed hazard. But that brings up an even larger kind of looming question for me.
What's that?
We just established that they pulled a 13-foot and a 12-foot alligator out of a shallow river where people casually go to cool off. Identifying the specific animal naturally leads to a much deeper question.
Why were they there?
Exactly. Why were there multiple massive predators aggressively occupying a popular recreation spot? Why did this tragedy happen right then, on that specific Sunday afternoon?
And this is where the forensic investigation merges directly with the biological realities of the region.
So what does this all mean? Because the source material points out a very specific pattern identified by wildlife experts.
It's a seasonal pattern.
Right. They note that these types of incidents become significantly more likely during certain seasonal periods. Specifically, they explain that alligators become fiercely territorial following their mating cycles.
The post-mating cycle is incredibly tense.
And what is even more alarming is that this specific tragedy on the Econlockhatchee River was not an isolated freak occurrence.
No, it wasn't a one-off.
The authorities note it's part of a concerning cluster of recent alligator encounters reported across Central Florida. The investigation is still ongoing to understand all the specific circumstances, but that biological pattern is clearly established.
It really requires us to completely reframe how we view animal attacks.
How so?
Well, often when we hear about a wild animal striking a human, our first assumption is that it was a hunt for food.
We assume the animal is just hungry.
Right. But the biological trigger the experts are pointing to here is quite different, and in many ways it creates a much more volatile situation for hikers.
Let me jump in and challenge this dynamic for a second.
Go for it.
If it's a known, established biological fact that alligators become hyperterritorial post-mating, and there is an active cluster of recent encounters happening across Central Florida, whose responsibility is it to manage this risk?
That is the big question.
Should the burden of knowledge be entirely on the weekend hikers? Does this represent a failure of human recreation habits, or is this just an inevitable, unavoidable clash between human leisure and natural cycles?
That is the ultimate tension at the heart of this tragedy. When wildlife experts talk about post-mating territoriality, they're talking about hardwired evolutionary alarm bells.
It's instinct.
Exactly. After the mating cycle, the hormones and instinctual drives to protect their space are at their absolute peak. The animal in that river isn't necessarily looking at a human being as prey to consume.
So it isn't a hunt.
No, it is an eviction.
Wow.
The alligator is looking at the human as an intruder in a space it is biologically hardwired to defend with extreme violence. It draws an invisible boundary line in the water, and anything that crosses that line is met with immediate force.
And the problem is, we can't see that invisible line.
Exactly. Nature's calendar operates completely independent of our weekend schedules.
They don't check the calendar to see if it's Sunday.
Right. The alligators in the Econlockhatchee River don't know that it's a sunny Sunday afternoon and humans are feeling hot and want to cool off. They only know that it's their post-mating season, and this specific stretch of shallow water belongs to them.
They're just defending their home.
So when you see a cluster of encounters in a region, it usually signals that human expansion and our desire for outdoor recreation are actively overlapping with the peak biological cycles of the apex predators that live there.
It really is a collision of two completely different worlds trying to occupy the exact same 3 feet of water.
It's a tragic overlap.
We look at the river and assume it's there for us to use as a cool-down spot. The 13-foot alligator intrinsically knows the river as its breeding and territorial ground. It is a fatal misunderstanding of who this space actually belongs to.
It is a devastating misunderstanding, and as we've seen, it's one that carries an incredibly high cost.
That is such a sobering way to synthesize all of this. And it really brings everything full circle for you, the listener. Because the next time you step into natural spaces, whether you are heading to a local river, a familiar hiking trail, or any wild environment to unwind after a long week, you have to remember the underlying reality of that space.
You're not just at a park.
No. You aren't just visiting a static, pretty backdrop designed for your weekend leisure. You are actively entering a dynamic, fiercely contested, living ecosystem.
And that ecosystem enforces its own invisible boundaries.
And its own rigid seasonal rules, regardless of whether we've taken the time to learn them or not.
It's a reality that demands a constant, unwavering level of situational awareness, which leaves us with a critical question to consider as we move forward.
Yeah.
As human populations continue to expand and our deep desire to escape into the outdoors grows, our paths are inevitably going to overlap more and more with the fiercely defended territories of apex predators.
It's bound to happen more often.
Exactly. So in light of this terrible tragedy and the concerning cluster of recent encounters across the region, do we need to fundamentally redefine what gives a place the title of a popular natural spot?
That's a profound question.
Because perhaps we need to collectively accept that out there in the wild, no matter how shallow the water seems or how sunny the day is, we are never truly just a visitor. We are always stepping into their territory.
We really are just wandering into their untamed reality. It forces you to look at that calm, inviting water in a completely different way. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep your eyes open out there.
Okay, one question for you. How did the emergency response unfold after the attack, and what factors contributed to the delay or inability to save the victim despite immediate distress calls and eyewitness assistance at the scene? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.